the Marzabotto massacre at the end of September 1944. And there was an account of a witness who had survived, and he was saying, I saw a baby being bayoneted, and all these women and children were just lined up and murdered. And it said, it was the biggest civilian massacre in Western Europe outside of, death camps, bigger than Ladici, bigger than Orador, Siglain. The rhythms of daily life of the annual seasons have just been going on year after year after year for centuries. And then suddenly this typhoon of steel arrives in southern Italy, and it's just bulldozes this terrible path up the leg. And anyone unfortunate enough to be in the middle of this, it's just horrific. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to San Pietro, which is just south of Cassino. There is the village as it was left in December 1943. And it's so wistful. And you're just there and you look into these houses, you can still see paint on the walls, you can see the kitchen sink, all this kind of stuff. You can half close your eyes and you can hear the laughter of children and the chatter of an Italian family, but it's gone. They're ghosts. That's the tragedy, and it moves me.
Welcome back to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci, and joining us, can't get enough of this man, James Holland, award-winning historian, best-selling writer. He's also a broadcaster, a fellow podcaster, a goal hanger with me, and this was part of his trilogy on the Italian campaign in World War II, and it's the last piece of his trilogy. And I'm going to venture to say that I think it's the best piece. I'm going to explain why in a second. But the title of the book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome. First of all, it's great to have you back on. Can't get enough of you, James. You know I'm a huge fan. But Cassino, to me, was the best because it was the conclusion. You got to see the channels of politics and human behavior all converging together. And you got to see the Italian citizens in terms of the mistakes that they were making. And what a lesson that is actually for today, by the way, James. And so I want to discuss that with you as well. But for me, this was human tragedy, warfare, strategy related to warfare, but it was also about human beings having a reckoning with themselves about what right and wrong in their country. So anyway, sorry I'm being so long-winded, but thank you for coming back on.
No, thank you for having me.
What kept pulling you back into the Italian campaign, though? Tell me why you decided your love affair with World War II continues, but why Italy, why the Italian campaign, which frankly is not as well written about as the Battle of the Bulge or the Battle of Britain, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I guess that was part of the reason, to be honest. But also, I mean, as you know, I'm a massive Italophile, so I love Italy. And actually,
and we
you're
love
right,
you, James. Okay, we love you, and Italy loves you. Okay.
Well, I've got to say, I mean, it is a trilogy because I wrote Sicily, Savage Storm, Cassino, kind of pretty much concurrently, together. But actually, about 20 years ago, I wrote a book which, if I suppose, would be the fourth in a quartet if you were to put them together. But it was such a long time ago, and it was such an outlier that it's hard to see it in those terms. But actually, that covered the last year of the war in Italy. It was called Italy's Sorrow, and it came out, I don't know, maybe best part of 20 years ago now. But what drew me that in the first place was I was reading a story in the Times newspaper over here in the UK. And it was a story about how the then German president, not the chancellor, the president, President Rao, had been to Italy, had been to Bologna, and he'd been to a little town called Marzabotto, which is about, I don't know, 15 miles south of Bologna. And there he had publicly apologized for a massacre that had taken place in the mountains overlooking Marzabotto, called the Marzabotto massacre at the end of September 1944. And there was an account of a witness who had survived, and he was saying, I saw a baby being bayoneted, and all these women and children were just lined up and murdered. And it said, it was the biggest civilian massacre in Western Europe outside of, death camps, bigger than Ladici, bigger than Orador, Siglain. I thought, what? How come I don't know about this? So I looked into it and started and tried to find out a bit more about it, and just got completely obsessed with it. And that was my start point for writing Italy's Sorrow. And I went out to Monte Sole, this mountain where this incredibly beautiful place where I think it was 785 civilians were massacred over a couple of days. And I interviewed some survivors, which was just the most amazing and grueling experience, and one that I will never forget. I mean, literally, when I was talking to Cornelia Pizzelli, who had lost her twin brother and sister Her mother, her father had seen it all from a mountain above and gone demented and died a couple of months later. Her second sister had been raped and badly wounded, but has survived too. And it was just, I can remember every bit of it. And I've been to that place. You can still go to the little cemetery where she was one of 202 of because the massacres within the bigger massacre. That were lined up in this little cemetery, and there's still bullet holes on the crosses and stuff and in the walls. I mean, you just can't believe it. And I remember there's one thing she told me, which I've never forgotten. She said that they were marched from the church into this walled cemetery. And she said there was one of the old ladies, and one of the Germans offered a hand to help this old lady through the gate and into the cemetery. And she just couldn't understand it. And it really stuck with me. And I wanted to understand what had happened, but I also wanted to understand why it had happened. And that then led me to kind of, thinking, well, why does no one know about the end of the war and partisans and fascists and Mussolini and all the Allied armies and, what the heck's going on in Italy, this amazing place that you and I love so much. So then I kind of put it to bed and I didn't do anything for all this time. And then I kind of did Sicily and then the invasion of Italy in 1943. And then, as you say, Cassino. So it was that kind of sucked me in the first place. And I've just, I visit Italy every year. There's not a year goes by where I don't go there. I love it. And I love the Italian people. And I think, their war experience is just such a tragedy. Mussolini just didn't have the greatest geopolitical understanding. He thought he could pull the wall over everybody. He thought that Britain was beaten, thought he had his main chance, and that he could dominate the Mediterranean and North Africa and East Africa. He thought he could just wrap it all up, be easy peasy. It was like his on a plate, and he hadn't reckoned on the Brits, fighting on in 1940. That, that took him to various forks in the road. He just kept taking the wrong one, and he ended up being embroiled in a war in the Mediterranean, and then, which ended in Tunisia in May 1943, which then progressed to Sicily, which then progressed to Italy, which he was, powerless to do anything about, really. As were the Italian people. I mean, after Mussolini was deposed in the third week of July 1943, the Italian leadership was just crippled. They were between a massive rock and a hard place. What do? Do you kind of just go, okay, we'll throw in the towel?
They were also occupied, though, right?
But if you do that, you're going to be absolutely shafted by the Germans, who will not take kindly. Or do you kind of try and hedge your bets? And and also their leadership just wasn't up to it. The king was pathetic. His senior ministers were just repugnant and morally just bankrupt.
Yeah.
And the poor Italian people, it might have been a nation since 1860 or whatever, but it was still wasn't really a nation state as such, despite fascism. Fascism was a structure for the cities, for Rome, maybe for the elites, but for your average Italian punter living in his little walled village, somewhere in the back arse of nowhere in a mountain in the Abruzzi Mountains or something. What do they care about Mussolini? What do they care about central authority? The rhythms of daily life of the annual seasons have just been going on year after year after year for centuries. And then suddenly this typhoon of steel arrives in southern Italy, and it's just bulldozes this terrible path up the leg. And anyone unfortunate enough to be in the middle of this it's just horrific. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to San Pietro, which is just south of Cassino. John Huston made a famous film about it, but there is the village as it was left in December 1943. And it's so wistful, Anthony. I mean, you're just there and you look into these houses, you can still see paint on the walls, you can see the kitchen sink, all this kind of stuff. You can half close your eyes and you can hear the laughter of children and the chatter of an Italian family, but it's gone. They're ghosts. It's gone. And that's the tragedy, and it moves me.
Oh, well, just to give you some context from my family. So my family, it was from one of those villages. It wasn't walled because it was up in the mountains, and it was an agrarian village. It was a farming village. And my grandparents obviously left that village because they were impoverished. Interestingly enough, my grandmother's brother stayed in the village. So when I was a young man, I used to go back to the village and see him and the house that my grandmother was born in and so forth. And that part of the family stayed there. But when they talked about the war, that's how they talked about it, which is what I found so fascinating about your book. You captured what the Italian people that were living outside of Rome felt about the war. Like, what the hell is going on, and why are we doing this? You know this about Bob Dole, the former
Hmm.
senator from Kansas. He was severely wounded in April of 1945 in the mountains. He was serving as a second lieutenant in the 10th Mountain
10th
Division.
Mountain. Yep.
Yep, when he was wounded, and he has a limited use of his right arm. When he went against Richard Nixon in the 1970s, and they asked him why, he said, "Well, I was wounded in Italy fighting for the Constitution." Imagine these people today. Fast forward, James, right? So
Yep.
no, Richard Nixon has broken the Constitution. I watched several of my friends die in these battles in Italy fighting for the
Yep.
Constitution. So even though he's part of my party, the Constitution, uber alles, the Constitution is more important than everything else, And so this stuff is gone now, James. And this is the sadness that I feel about it. When I read your books, the books are about valor. There's books. The book represents confusion from some of the Italian citizens, some hope, some despair. But the books are really about valor and what people did during the war, personal sacrifices they were making for the greater good of something, the rejection of fascism and the pursuit of freedom. But I want to go to the Gustav Line. What is the Gustav Line? Tell us what it is. Tell us why it was so important. Talk about the morale. Talk about the weather
Hmm.
during the period of time. But start with the Gustav Line, if you don't mind.
Well, sure thing. Well, the Gustav Line is the second part of a kind of like a double lock. Think of like the most secure safe you can think of. You've got the first cage, outside the front, and you've got to let through that. Then you've got to get through the next door before you can get to your moolah. And that's the first line is the Bernhard Line, and U.S. Fifth Army under the command of General Mark W. Clark bashes its way through this. And by the way, this is an international army as well. It might be the U.S. Army, but it's got British troops, it's got Indian troops, it's got a North African troops, French troops in it, and Canadians for that matter as well, all fighting under the banner of U.S. Fifth Army. They get their way through the Bernhard Line, and then literally 8 miles further on is the Gustav Line. The Gustav Line is not, it's like the Great Wall of China or anything like that. It's not like a solid wall of defense. It's a series of interlocking defenses. So it's a series of you'd have kind of machine gun posts and mortar positions up in the mountains, interlocking fire, so they're all crossing, every little bit covered. You'd have observers on the high ground looking down on the valleys. That's where the roads are. So those are your key arteries if you're attacking and trying to push north to Rome. You'd have lots of minefields around the rivers, lots of barbed wire. It's pretty solidly defended. And the big problem is when you've got these artillery observers on the high ground, they are looking down on the roads and they are directing artillery fire, which is further back, indirect fire. So they're lobbing shells in an arc over the mountains onto this road. And it's all been zeroed. So what that means is they've already worked out the coordinates of where they've got to drop their shells. So anything that moves along that road is just going to get absolutely trashed unless you cleared the observer from the high ground above. But the trouble is the observers are then defended by infantry, also in the mountains above. And the big problem for the Allies is they're very mechanized. That's their kind of USP, is use steel, not flesh, to do a lot of the hard yards as you possibly can. But in winter, in mountains, there's a limit to how many Shermans you can send up a mountain, or Dodge trucks, or GMCs, or half tracks, or whatever. This ends up being a foot slogger's war, augmented by the use of mules, which Americans and British and French are not really trained to use in the first place, to get up there. It's brutal. It is absolutely brutal. These mountains are really high. They're kind of 3,000 foot high plus. Lots of jagged peaks, lots of gullies where mortars and machine guns can hide. Lots of very, very thin soil. And what that means is that when a mortar round comes down, which is a fairly small explosive, or a bigger shell from an artillery piece comes down, it chips lots of, not only does it splinter and spray shrapnel, bits of metal all over the place, it also smashes the rock because there's no soil to absorb the explosion. And razor sharp shards of stone also kind of fly around the place. So it's just absolutely horrendous. And what the Allies discovered was that when you attack these positions, there's only so many men you can attack with at one time, and it ends up being quite a narrow front because you physically can't fit more than, let's say, for example, a company's strength attack, which would be about 100 men, on one place. And they get mowed down or cut down or kind of cut to pieces or whatever, you know, but 30% wounded, 10% dead, so suddenly you're kind of 60% down on where you are, can't really function. And then you send the next 100 in, and then the next 100, and it just rotates, and you can never attack en masse, and that's the problem they have. But they're so close at the end of January, beginning of February 1944, despite the awful weather, despite the conditions, despite being very much kind of bottom of the pile in terms of priorities in the war in Europe. They're so close to the breakthrough, but they just can't quite do it. And that's the tragedy for all concerned, including the Germans, I hasten to add, who are also having an absolutely horrific time.
You know, it's as brutal as Normandy. It's as brutal as anything else that we've seen in the war, and yet it's fairly underreported. When I was a kid, my grandmother, I used to collect these models, put these models together. I'm gonna send you the picture of the box, but it was a
Yeah,
1968 vintage Aurora, the model company, Anzio Beach. Okay, and my
Nice.
grandmother said, "Okay, you have to learn about Anzio Beach." And I was 7 years old. What the hell is Anzio Beach? And then when I read your book about Anzio Beach, I didn't realize the stalemate that took
Yeah.
place at Anzio Beach. So tell us a little bit about this, because this is obviously the Allies are coming into the beach. The beach is incredibly well fortified, in some ways even more well fortified than Normandy Beach.
Yeah.
And they're stuck on the beach. Tell us a little bit
Well,
about that.
yeah, so the idea with Anzio is to do an invasion behind the Gustav Line, kind of about 30 miles south of Rome, and kind of hopefully unlock the Gustav Line. So the plan is to hammer the Gustav Line in lots of different places all at once, or in sequence rather. Draw lots of German troops away from that, and then at the same time do this attack round the back. And hopefully the combination of this huge pressure on the Gustav Line combined with kind of the risk of being attacked round the back would kind of would persuade the Germans to abandon that position and retreat back to the north. And I have to say, literally every single German commander in Italy thought that that was definitely the right course of action. The only person who didn't was the guy who was our overall commander-in-chief, was a chap called Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was a Luftwaffe Field Marshal. But he was also the overall ground commander, well, the overall military commander in Italy at that time. And he was sort of slavishly devoted to his oath to Hitler. And Hitler had turned his eagle eye onto the Italian campaign. And when the Hitlerian spotlight falls on you, that's pretty bad news, because it means you can run, but you can't hide. Well, you can't run and you can't hide either. And it means no reverses. You can't retreat. So you just have to keep going, even though your men are absolutely a breaking point. So everyone else was going, I really think we should pull back, Herr Generalfeldmarschall. And Kessler was going, no, I can't, because the Führer won't let me. So it could have worked. The big problem that the Allies have is the obvious thing to do in Italy, where it's long and narrow and it's got lots of mountains, and it really doesn't sort of encourage an overland approach, is to outflank it by sea. And all Allied operations are by their nature amphibious, because they've got to come from America or from Britain, and they've got to get across oceans and seas and stuff. So they all are, but it doesn't matter the fact that, well, first of all, there were no landing craft in 1939, and there weren't really very many, and even until 1941. And so the landing craft, the assault craft, the Higgins boat, but also the much bigger landing ships, which are about 120 yards long, and those are the really key things. They were new to warfare in the early part of the 1940s. And the Americans alone, between May 1942 and April 1943, built 8,719 assault craft of varying kind, which seems like a huge number. But then you have to think, oh, yeah, but hang on a minute. They're also fighting an island-hopping war in the Pacific. Oh, and by the way, you've got to do Sicily. And they're all taking huge amount of punishment, because these landing craft aren't just depositing people on the day of the invasion. they're going back every single day, all day, every day, day and night, dropping supplies off. And every time a landing craft hits the beach, it's a crash landing. You're coming onto the beach. And these things are really cheaply made, so they cause damage, which then means you've got to repair them. And at the same time, by the way, you've also got to prepare for Operation Overlord, which is the priority in the main event. So what sounds like a huge number of landing craft actually it means there isn't much left for an operation in Anzio. There's enough to make it a punt worth taking, but there isn't enough to guarantee decisive victory. And that's the problem. And that is not the fault of General Alexander, who is the overall commander-in-chief of the Allies in Italy. It's certainly not the fault of Mark Clark, who is the US Fifth Army commander. It's certainly not the fault of the troops. It's just the way it is. You can only do what you can do with what you've got. And the Allies constantly throughout the Second World War are constantly fighting this battle between got to get a move on, got to get the war over and done with, but at the same time, we don't want to have catastrophic losses. So it's a kind of, and we've only got X number of supplies. I mean, everyone always wants more than they've got, and that is absolutely the case for Italy. And the real problem with Italy is that there's enough to do something to make it worth invading Sicily, but there's not enough to secure a victory easily and convincingly. And that's the fate of the poor bastards that end up having to kind of slog up mountains or land on the Anzio beachhead. And they just don't quite have enough. And the commander of the American Corps that goes in, which again is a polyglot force of British and Americans, US 6 Corps. He's not a thruster. He's not a kind of tactical genius. He's not a kind of a
Clark,
pattern.
right? This is General Clark, right?
No, this is John Lucas.
John Lucas.
Mark Clark,
Okay,
I think, is superb. I'm a big fan of
No,
Mark
I was going
Clark.
to say, you write very favorably of Mark Clark.
Yeah, I think he's great. I think he, no man has in the U.S. Army ever has a larger army, a single army. I mean, there are commanders like Bradley or obviously Eisenhower who have armies under their command, but no one has a larger single army than Mark Clark, and not a single American army commander has the nationalities that he has to deal with. Which makes life a lot more complicated because you're dealing with lots of cultural differences and all sorts of stuff, and politics come into play in a way they don't if it's just your own nation, own national force. So he does all that, and he's broken through the Bernhard Line in winter, which is an amazing feat. He's very closely, nearly broken through the Gustav Line. He's not given enough landing craft to be comfortable for Anzio, but it kind of almost works. And what it does do is draw off a huge amount of German troops, and when they counterattack at Anzio, they get rebuffed. So that's both tying down lots of German troops and destroying them, attriting them at the same time. And when you're then planning your big effort, which is Operation Diadem, which is finally launched on the evening of the 11th of May, 1944, which is a big, big concentrated effort. Now the rains have dried out and the mud has turned to dust and all the rest of it. You can bring to bear your superiority in air power and mechanization and all the rest of it. Suddenly, having that foothold in the Anzio bridgehead, 30 miles south of Rome and kind of 40 miles north of the Gustav Line, is really damn useful. So, I'm broadly in favor of. I think the Anzio bridgehead was a good idea, and I don't think it was the fault of the ground commanders. It's if you want to do any finger pointing for the failures of the Italian campaign, point them at the combined chiefs of staff who authorized it in the first place without the proper kind of backing and support and prioritization.
Well, you may remember this. Churchill wanted more of an attack through the Mediterranean. Roosevelt didn't want it. He wanted to wait for the Normandy invasion, and so you can see some of the implications here in these battles. I'm gonna implore you to look at the text that I sent you and look at the copywriting on the instruction manual for the model, because it's 1968, James, and this is copywriting for a 7-year-old's model, and the density of history that's in the copywriting is extraordinary. I went back and looked at it in preparation for this interview, and the copywriter knew the story, as rendered in your book. All right, well, we're getting to the last few minutes of this podcast, so we unfortunately have to limit these things to 30 minutes.
Of course.
But I want to go to the 5 words, the famous 5 words that me and my producer come up with. I'm going to say the word. You're going to give me the feeling that you get when I mention the word. These are actually people, because they're in and around tangentially this story about the Italy campaign. So let's start with Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Well, I think he was a great man. I think he was a man of vision. He was a man of enormous geopolitical understanding. And he was a man who offered possibilities. You know, when you're in a life and death struggle, you need people that can persuade you. You need people that can bind you. You need men of vision, of dynamism, of charisma. You know, that's the problem with the moment is we haven't got those guys. I mean, you know, say what you like about Keir Starmer. I mean, he seems like a very nice man, and I think he's an honourable fellow. This is the current Prime Minister of Britain, but you know, is he hugely charismatic and a great visionary? Not so sure. So I think he was a great man. You know, he's flawed, of course. All the great men are. But thank goodness for the developed world and the democratic world that he was the political leader of Great Britain in 1940 and throughout the whole of World War II.
No question. I mean, he literally in so many different ways, man of the century. I think because Roosevelt was a charmer. Roosevelt was a great strategist. He pulled the Americans through the Depression and helped to manage the war. But without Churchill holding ground in May and June of 1940, it would have been a much darker, much worse world. There would have been not a lot that the Americans could have done without Churchill's steadfastness and his inspiration to his fellow citizens. So let's go to Franklin Roosevelt. Let's go to FDR.
Well, I just think I think he is one of the great men of the century. I think for me, he's the greatest president you've ever had.
Well, we agree. Again, Dominic Sandbrook and I are always fighting. James Holland, we're always fighting about different things. We both agree on FDR, so this would be the trilogy of Holland, Scaramucci, and Sandbrook on FDR. But tell us why you feel that way.
Well, I think he's a great man, and I'll tell you for why. Because I think he understood very early on the Wilsonian utopia, this idea of free trade, low tariffs, we'll all be beautiful together, everyone be happy and prosperous, and then you won't want to go to war. That was great, but it was just ahead of its time, and the delivery wasn't right. But he knew that the premise of it was spot on, and that's what he was working to from the moment he comes into power. And what are the first things he do? He enacts a good neighbor policy. He goes, we've been traditionally really against Mexico and our Latin American neighbors. We've been brutal to them. Let's be nice to them, and maybe so the trade deficit might work against us on the bookkeeping. But overall, we'll be richer for this, because if everyone's happy and prosperous, then we can benefit from that prosperity. And he was absolutely right. And he then took this into the Four Freedoms, which he announced on his inauguration in March 1941. You know, freedom of self-determination, freedom of religion, freedom of fear, freedom of want. I mean, what's not to like about any of those four freedoms? Which then gets developed into the Atlantic Charter, which he sort of, springs on Churchill and absolutely gets him to sign up to in a moment of just striking genius. Out of that comes Bretton Woods, which is an economic conference in July 1944 in which the IMF and the World Bank get established. Again, what's not to like about this? I mean, this has helped stabilize economies Britain's been a beneficiary of an IMF bailout. Looks like France is about to be a beneficiary of an IMF bailout. This is what stabilizes economies when they're going through particularly tough times. And as we all know, when the economy is rough, politics can get rough. When politics gets rough, economies can get rough. And when economies and politics get rough, you can have war. It's like a really easy three-way process. So in the future, let's try and limit that. And out of that comes his vision for the post-war, which is inherited by Harry S. Truman, which for me is kind of a pretty close second, actually, to Roosevelt. I think he's a great man because he's not born to greatness. He's not obviously great. He's a humble guy from Independence, Missouri, from the Midwest. He hasn't been to university. He has nothing about him on the evening of 12th of April that suggests he's going to be a great president. But I think he is, and he is the one who, it's a Marshall Plan, but really it's a Truman Plan. And he's the guy who persuades Congress, persuades America that the victors need to help out financially the vanquished to make a better world. Again, genius. I mean, I've riffed off from Roosevelt, but I mean, he's a great man. Great man.
And the most fascinating thing about all of that is that he only meets Roosevelt a few times.
Yes.
Okay, and so what people forget, David McCullough writes about this in a biography 33 years ago. he's reading through Roosevelt's papers. He asks Eleanor Roosevelt for his papers. And he's like, okay, listen. And he says this literally to his staff. This guy is better and way bigger than me. I don't even know how the hell I'm going to fill his shoes. But let me tell you something. All these ideas that he has, I'm going to try to execute. And then he does something that we don't do anymore, James. There is a senator by the name of Arthur Vandenberg. He was a senator from Michigan from 1928 to 1951. He was a member of the opposition. He was a devout isolationist. Truman goes to him. He had worked with him in the Senate. He's now the president of the United States. Vandenberg's a Republican. He goes to Vandenberg and he lays out the plan. And Vandenberg, this Midwestern American idealist, sides with Truman. Think about this.
Yeah,
okay, no, we're not going to pee on each other. We're not going to blast each other. We're going to build a new, better world. Okay, and that world is going to be on the back of America, and that world is going to be supported by America. Okay, and we fast forward 80 years, we have this grievance president now that wants to extract pain from the rest of the world. It's so heartbreaking for somebody like me, because this is, the Scaramucci family's had an eternal love affair with America, and to watch America go into this direction, it would be like if Charles Lindbergh had won the 1940 presidential election as opposed to FDR. Okay,
this is precisely why I'm writing a book about it right now. I mean, I'm doing a very short 40,000 word polemic on all this stuff. And it's just fascinating.
And unfortunately for you, you'll have to come back on Open Book and you have to describe this book to me after I'm done reading it.
I'm just tell me when I'm there.
All right, so let's go to the last three. Okay, Joseph Stalin. How does, and I want, in the context of the Italian trilogy, Joseph Stalin.
Well, he's a monster. He's an absolute monster, and he's constantly interfering. He's trying to get, what he wants is a communist Italy, over which he can have yet more influence. I mean, his burning ambition, once he realizes he's not going to lose the war, is to hoover up as much territory as he possibly can under his own influence. Because he's power crazy. It's not because he's ideologically communist. It's because he's power crazy, like another person in charge of Russia at the moment. And he's constantly putting a spanner in the works, and it makes life very difficult. One of the consequences of this, by the way, is that the British are trying to rearm the partisans in the north, a number of whom are, or the majority of whom are, in communist-backed resistance brigades, Garibaldi brigades. And what the British do is they say, "Oh yeah, we're gonna do this arms drop at a certain time. We're gonna send you loads of stuff. It's gonna be great. We're gonna send you some British and American liaison officers. They're gonna help with the drops and everything. It's all gonna be cool." And then they never happen. Or, "Oh no, it got crashed into a mountain. Oh, I'm really sorry about that." Or, "It didn't happen." So the gulf between what the British and Americans were actually saying they were delivering to partisans in the Alps and the upper Apennines, and what they were actually delivering was enormous. So they were delivering a trickle, promising a huge amount. Consequence of that was that lots of partisans struggled and died and suffered and were killed needlessly. That was because at the end of the war, the last thing the Allies want is lots of commies running around northern Italy with Sten guns and Tommy guns and stuff. And that's a direct consequence of the interference of Stalin.
Okay, last two. Adolf Hitler.
Oh, it's just... I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, if you think about the end of the First World War, why does it end? It ends because Germany's not going to win and they've run out of money. On that basis, Germany should have thrown in the towel in November 1941. That Barbarossa had failed. They hadn't got to Moscow. They couldn't possibly win. Take an arbitrary date like the middle of June 1941. Middle of June, Germany's got one enemy: Britain plus dominions and empire. Fast forward 6 months, it's got three enemies. It's got the USA, USSR, and Britain plus empire and dominions. It's not going to win. It's not going to win. Give up. But of course he can't, because Hitler, it's 1,000-year Reich or it's Armageddon. He's a black and white kind of guy. There's no gray area whatsoever. And so he consigns Germany and the rest of the world that comes into contact with him, and of course Europe's Jews, to this catastrophe from which the ramifications are still being felt. So, I mean, he's delusional and mad and just a despicable character in every
But
single way.
but in addition to all of that, his generals know that certain strategies are incredibly flawed. We can go to the
Yeah.
Ardennes, we could go to Cassino, we could
Yep.
go to Normandy, we could go to Calais, where he thinks Patton is amassing an army in Calais, and yet they listen to him. And it's very reminiscent of what's going on right now. You have a group of people, wow, the guy's crazy, he's saying crazy things, but
Yep.
no, we're going to kowtow to the guy. So when people look back on these things, they always have the following attitude, James. Oh, that wouldn't be me. That wouldn't be me to tell the emperor that he doesn't have. Now, of course, I would tell the emperor he has no clothes on, but they don't. They sit there and they tell the emperor that they're beautifully adorned. And so it's just a
Well, the big thing
fascinating
is that history doesn't repeat itself, but patterns of human behavior do, and that's a subtle difference, but it's a really, really important difference. In other words,
Exactly right.
people behave the same way when they're confronted with certain scenarios.
No
And when
question.
there
It's
is someone who is kind of autocratic and powerful and has a certain kind of charisma, people just fall at their feet. They just do, and it's the trappings of power. It's like a sort of spell has been cast on people. I mean, you experienced it yourself very briefly. I mean, you know what I'm talking about here. What do you call it? The Potomac,
Mhm. Potomac
the
fever. No, it's Potomac
Potomac
fever.
fever. Yeah, right.
You wanna be close to the power, you have an infection for this, and then you
Right.
start to your mind wanders away from your principles into something more delusional. And so, listen, no, and by the way, the reason why I think I'm a good candidate to talk about this is that I fell into it. I felt I was susceptible to it. So you can sit there and pretend otherwise, that you're moral and you're principled and all these other things, but we're human and we have a tendency to do human things being human. And so there's human frailty, James, and that's why this period of time is so interesting, because there were so many men and women in times of great stress where they rose to the occasion as opposed to falling into something more frail. Okay, the last
Yeah.
guy on my list, and then I'm gonna let you go, sir, is Dwight David Eisenhower.
Oh, what a great man. I mean, again, what I love him for the same reason I love Harry S. Truman. Humble guy, born in Texas, brought up in Abilene. I've been to his house, the family home in Abilene, Kansas, by the way. It's a pretty humble place. The railroads still cross the center of town. And yet there he is suddenly on the world stage, and he responds to that, and he just gets it. And one of the things that makes D-Day successful, one of the things that makes the Western allies so successful, is because they're not actually allies, they're a coalition. They're not formal allies at all. And the coalition, and particularly the one that kind of sees Allied forces invading Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, is, in my mind, the apogee of coalition warfare, of cooperation, of coordination, of coming together towards a single common goal that everyone gets. Everyone knows what they've got to do. Everyone's pulling together. Doesn't matter that you might have different views. Doesn't matter that you might come from different cultural backgrounds. Doesn't matter that kind of when all this fighting's over, you're going to have a few things that you need to iron out. Right now, right here, the most important thing is to get the hell out of rid of the world of Nazism and get a job done. And he is just the master at focusing that and bringing that together and ensuring that little international spats and schisms, or even just national spats and schisms, that there are as many spats and problems and arguments and personality clashes within the U.S. Armed Forces as there are between British and American, or between British and British. So the idea that it's kind of everyone in America is Anglophobe and everyone in Britain is Americophobe is just nonsense compared to the kind of alliances that Germany has. They're a marriage made in heaven. But if they are a marriage made in heaven, I honestly believe they were, they're like the kind of adored couple that kind of stick together 35 years, but have a few spats occasionally and kind of, a few periods where they're not talking to each other. But generally it kind of works. And the person who's binding it, who's the glue on all of that, is Eisenhower. And let's also not forget that he's the guy at 4:15 a.m. on Monday, the 5th of June, 1945. It's not raining outside. They could actually go that day, but they don't. They've decided to postpone 24 hours. The weather looks dodgy. There's a narrow little bubble of high pressure that may disappear off into the North Sea, or it may not. on his shoulders rests the decision. Only he can make that decision. Do we go or not go? He
Yeah,
sits on his
60
armchair in the library,
60
puts his hands, and he goes, okay, let's go, and does it.
60 cigarettes into the decision, right? Smoking
Right.
1.5,
Yeah, his camels. Yeah. But point is, he makes arguably the single most important decision that anyone in the Allied High Command has to make in World War
Churchill
II.
ringing in his ear, and listen,
He's a great man, great man.
He is so underappreciated also as a president. I mean, because there were so many things he did in the post-World War II era that kept the peace despite the intensity of the
NATO.
Cold War, the rise of anti-communism in the U.S. and all the different things that he did. But these were great men, and you are one hell of an historian, and I really appreciate you coming on, James. The title of the book is Cassino 44, The Brutal Battle for Rome, but embedded in this book is lessons in psychology, lessons in warfare, lessons in principles, and it's amazingly well done. I appreciate you coming on to discuss it. Thanks, James.
Oh, thank you so much, as always.